Okay, actual archaeology, not just weird theory about who Celts are, what Celts are. I want to start out with settlement archaeology. And I think settlement archaeology can get a bit of a bad rap. People like to talk about big monuments, things like the pyramids of Giza, or like actual things, the stuff, the artifacts that we find in settlements. Settlements and houses are kind of secondary to most people's interest when they're talking about archaeology. If you actually think about it, if we look around at where I am right now, we spend a lot of our lives living in houses, and more broadly, in settlements. Things like cities and towns, or whatever it is where we live nowadays. The thing is, we take them as for granted because they are so present in our lives. It doesn't really occur to us how built up by human agency these things are. We don't really realize that there are lots of different ways of living. So in the past, if you're going to understand how people lived, you have to really look at the settlements, at the ways they were making shelter for themselves, at the way they were structuring the different places that they did things. And if you ever go to a place like Britain and Ireland who actually do archaeological field work, you'll find pretty quickly that settlements and stuff are a lot of what you're going to be digging up. And they're also important for understanding a period of time like what we call this kind of Celtic period. The settlements are fairly distinctive. Sometimes we just find scattered houses and things kind of off on their own. You'll find them in places like sand dunes, just kind of chilling there. But most of the time what we find in Britain and Ireland are these things called hill forts. They aren't necessarily always forts per se. Don't think of them really as military garrisons or anything, but that's what they get called. A really famous example is Cadbury Camelot, which is in southwestern Britain, and kind of in the mythology of the place gets associated with King Arthur, hence the name Camelot. But if you actually see what this place is, it's a massive hill. Now you're kind of like, oh, it's a hill, it's not really an archaeological site, until you realize, hey, that hill is really flat. It's actually so flat that farmers in different periods of time have used it as a field to grow crops. Then along the side, once you get off the flat bit, it actually kind of has this weird terraced, well, not exactly terraced, but what it is that it's been built up to have a series of banks and ditches going up the sides. The idea is that it's been fortified, it's been made difficult to get up, so that the people living up top, where the houses and things were kind of protected. Now, Cadbury Camelot is a massive example of this. If you see the place, it's enormous, and it's kind of incredible to think about how much manpower went into making that place. There are also smaller examples though, and Cadbury Camelot is this kind of irregularly shaped, I don't even know how to describe what shape it is because it doesn't really have a shape in my mind, but other places you find these smaller ones that are just kind of on top of little hills, and in Ireland especially we find them that are more circular, and we call them ring forts. Most of these in Ireland are called raths, and they're just simple, as I said, they're circular, and they've got a ditch around the farthest outside. And then just inside of the ditch there's a bank, so you can kind of dig out the ditch and then build up the bank just inside of that. And then inside of your rath you have the houses and probably some places to grow a few crops, keep some animals in there if you have to, but most of the time that stuff would be outside as well. The walls of the rath, that bank that I was talking about, are kind of what make it a rath. They're just generally made up of dirt. Now, as I said with Cadbury Camelot, the idea was that these things were fortified. Now, you will hear people say that, oh, if the ditch isn't this deep and if the wall isn't this high, it's not really for fortification, that's not really defensive. Sometimes that sort of makes sense, but I think most people are wrong about that. People weren't just doing it for fun, and they weren't just doing it kind of symbolically because they thought that was what a house was supposed to be. If you were going to attack a house, and you had to go down into a ditch, and the person who was defending this house from you was on top of a bank, even if the ditch was only like half a meter down, you're going to be at a disadvantage. And in the grand scheme of things, if those archaeologists that say the ditch isn't deep enough to really be defensive want to go out and try that theory, I think they'd find that their marauding skills aren't as good as they think. Alas, things like marauding are generally frowned upon in the realm of experimental archaeology, so I don't think that'll ever actually happen, but I think I'm right about that one. Now, there are other ring forts like this in Ireland that get called cashels. Now, they're different from raths, sort of, because the walls of that bank are made with a lot of stone. Some of them are actually entirely stone. Now, the thing about that actually being different from a rath is that in a lot of ways it's really just the same thing made with different material. Is it actually a completely different kind of settlement because it's made with stone instead of with dirt? I don't really think so, and the thing about it is that a lot of the ones that are made with rocks, the castles, are just kind of in rocky places where you find more available rocks to do the same sort of thing you do with a rath in a place where there isn't as many rocks. There were also some more rare settlement types like craneaux, which were actually built out over water, so we had log piles and things that were put down beneath a thing like a lake to hold an enclosure up over top of the surface. You had all your buildings in there surrounded by the water to keep the place protected. It just had a causeway connecting it to the land. They're really cool sites because for one you can find waterlogged, so they have really good preservation. Also you can just find really cool things there, and you think about it, that would have taken a lot of work to build a settlement out on top of water, very Venetian of them. They're sometimes interpreted as royal sites because of that you had some kind of leader living in these places with their family or maybe their entourage. There are also these sites that are some of my favorite archaeological sites called promontory forts. So this is where you have kind of a little peninsula or headland that's just connected to the mainland by a small bit of land, so it's surrounded by cliffs or just water on most of its sides. Sometimes you find them inland in a similar situation where the cliffs are really high. The point is you just kind of have a bit of connecting land to somewhere else that you can build a wall and ditch across, so you're protected just by that one wall. They're kind of cool because they are actually usually found starting in the Iron Age, but their use continued into the early medieval period, which is actually true with a lot of different sites. Things like craneaux and ring forts can be found that were still occupied hundreds of years later after being built in the early medieval period. And all that's just kind of the enclosure and the actual buildings and things to make a proper settlement, right? But most of the time they'll just be kind of centrally located inside of whatever hill fort or ring fort you're looking at. Other times though, they'll be put in places where they kind of have more visibility. In a promontory fort, for example, they might be looking out over the water so they can kind of see who's coming and going. They have all those ditches and banks around their settlements, so they're kind of concerned with security. Most of the buildings you'll find are probably types of houses. There are different outbuildings as well. For the most part, they all just kind of get called huts. They were made with different organic materials. They were probably pretty flimsy. They don't really preserve most of the time, which is kind of why craneaux are so interesting, because the water preserves buildings and things in ways that they wouldn't be otherwise. Most of the time what we actually find are just things like post holes. So it's a place where we can see the soil is different color. It's where a stake or something used to be stuck into the ground. There are also gullies, usually cut around the outside of where a house would have been. It was just kind of like a gutter where waste could have gone away to. So they were probably being made with things like wattle and daub, which is where you kind of weave fairly thin branches and things together and pack it with organic materials like manure to make your walling. And there was stuff like straw and reeds woven together on the roof to make thatch. Houses are usually pretty distinguishable from other buildings because they'll have a hearth, which is a place where you are making a fire inside of the home. You'll find bits of charcoal from the fire, things like seeds that have fallen in and turned to carbon so they preserve better than they otherwise would have. On top of that, the ground underneath the fire actually gets changed by the heat. It'll kind of bake into a really hard layer that's really easy to distinguish. A place like a metalworking shop in a little outbuilding will look pretty different because, well, for one, you'll be finding little remains from the iron that's being worked. You'll also usually be in a different place. That's kind of an extreme example because you have to keep iron working away from other settlements. I mean, you're inside this kind of flimsy wood-built house. You don't want the furnace from an ironworking shop getting away on you and burning the rest of the settlement down. The buildings, the huts we're talking about, are pretty much circular most of the time, so it's fairly simple. In certain places though, like Scotland, they'll have variations on that. They have these things called wheel houses, where the huts are kind of bigger and they have little rooms around the outside. It gives it this kind of spoked appearance. Sometimes too you'll have more than one little circular piece put together, There are these really cute ones in Scotland that get called jelly baby houses because of the way the different rooms are organized. It looks like a little gummy human, so they get this adorable jelly baby name. They're actually, I think, properly called cellular houses. In Ireland, there are also ones where you'll kind of see more than one house stuck together to make a kind of figure of eight. These are usually thought to be more higher status homes, someone who was allowed to have a bit more space, or that needed a bit more space for, kind of accepting people in, kind of holding audiences is the idea. And there are also things like law tracts that seem to back this up, the idea that certain types of people were supposed to have bigger or smaller homes. The thing you have to remember about them, because sometimes you can see these little huts and think they're kind of diminutive and they wouldn't be that nice to live in, they were actually really bright once you had the fire going in the middle, and you would have been filled with your loved ones. And we kind of look at an archaeological site and go, oh, that looks tiny, it's just this little hole in the ground. But if you actually kind of see a reconstruction of what it would have been like, or you even just kind of lie down inside the archaeological site, they can be surprisingly big. There are some little things in Ireland called boolie houses that just look like these tiny, they should be a single room, and you actually lie out in them and you realize, oh, this is actually really big. I could have lain across this one part of this thing and it would have been a perfectly fine bedroom for me. So there's sort of a matter of perception there and understanding what you're looking at. That's kind of where the interpretation of archaeology comes in, not just taking these material remains at face value of what they are, but understanding what they would have been like and how people would have experienced them. Now, most of these buildings are these kind of circular hut things that I've been describing. There are other places, though, where you'll find rectilinear buildings, which is just kind of a fancy word for squarish. Some people have argued that over the early medieval period there was kind of a growing tendency to build this new rectilinear construction. Other people argued that it wasn't an indigenous innovation that got brought in by peoples like Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, but then other people discredited them. Still other people said that no, rectilinear construction was always around, it just wasn't always that popular. It got more popular in some places, not in others. It's a more involved debate than I really know about, but it's something to keep in mind. Another thing, though, that I think is really cool about medieval settlements are called souterrains. If you know French, it just comes from sous, which means under, and terrain, which means terrain, the earth, so underground. It's kind of easy to think of these things as little cellars, which some people thought they were, little places for storage to keep your food cool. But what they really are is these kind of tunnels, and they'll have things like false turns and pitfalls and kind of weird holes going up to the ground. What they were actually for was another defensive feature. So if your little settlement was getting raided, you could actually duck down into this thing. It'd be really easy to defend yourself. If you're kind of around a corner with a spear and someone's coming at you around it, it's pretty easy to fend them off in this little confined space that you know your way around and other people don't. And I said there are sometimes these little holes. People actually think they would have been sort of like chimneys, so people couldn't even get smoked out of these things by someone that wanted to carry them off. There was slaving and things in these areas in the early medieval period. By the early medieval period, there can be sort of an image of peoples in Ireland, Scotland stuff as kind of pastoralists, just sort of placidly taking care of cows if they aren't monks praying fervently in monasteries. The settlement archaeology kind of says something different, though. It wasn't just when Scandinavians started coming over in the Viking Age that people were at each other's throats. There was lots of conflict in these places. There were a bunch of factions or tribal loyalties going on with people vying for resources and position and power. It's a really different image that we get from looking at the settlement archaeology. Kind of cool for this stuff that's kind of boring in most people's imaginations. But anyways, I'm going to have to leave it on there because I think I've gone way over time than I meant to, so I'll bring you more next week.